March 15, 1945, Okinawa Pacific Theater. Commander David McCampbell watches his radar screen with growing dread as 16 Grumman F8F Bearcats climb to intercept a formation of Japanese fighters approaching the American fleet. The Bearcat represents everything the Navy wanted in a carrier fighter: a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,100 horsepower, a top speed of 421 miles per hour, and a climb rate that can reach 20,000 feet in just 4 minutes and 12 seconds. On paper, it should dominate anything the Japanese can throw at it. But McCampbell knows what the statistics show. In the past 3 months, Bearcats engaging Mitsubishi A6M5 Zeros in turning dogfights have achieved a kill ratio of only 2.3 to 1, far below the 7 to 1 ratio that Hellcats managed in 1944. Worse, 14 Bearcat pilots have died in these encounters, their powerful fighters unable to match the Zero's legendary maneuverability in sustained turns. The Bearcat can catch a Zero in a straight line and destroy it with superior firepower, but the moment combat devolves into a turning fight, the advantage evaporates. McCampbell listens to the radio chatter as his pilots engage. Within 90 seconds, 2 Bearcats are smoking, their pilots calling out damage. One manages to limp away, the other doesn't. The problem isn't the airplane. The Bearcat possesses everything needed to win. The problem is that standard Navy doctrine, perfected over 4 years of war, doesn't work with this particular aircraft. What McCampbell doesn't know is that 7,000 miles away in California, a test pilot with no combat experience and a reputation for breaking rules is about to discover something that will transform the Bearcat from a disappointment into the most feared fighter in the Pacific. A technique so counterintuitive that senior Navy brass will initially call it suicidal nonsense. The Grumman F8F Bearcat program began in 1943 with a simple mandate: create the smallest, lightest airframe possible around the most powerful engine available. The Navy wanted a fighter that could intercept Japanese kamikaze attacks before they reached the fleet, which meant unprecedented climb rate and acceleration. Grumman's engineers delivered exactly what was requested. When the first prototype flew on August 20, 1944, it weighed just 7,070 pounds empty, nearly 1,500 pounds lighter than the F6F Hellcat it was designed to replace. But this obsession with weight created an unexpected problem. To save every possible pound, Grumman minimized the Bearcat's wing area to just 244 square feet, compared to the Hellcat's 334 square feet. The result was a wing loading of 38 pounds per square foot at combat weight, the highest of any American carrier fighter. In practical terms, this meant the Bearcat had to maintain higher speeds in turns to generate sufficient lift, which translated directly into larger turning radius. Navy test pilots at Patuxent River Naval Air Station discovered this limitation immediately. In sustained turning engagements against captured A6M5 Zeros, the Bearcat consistently lost. The Zero, with its massive wing area of 229 square feet, supporting a combat weight of only 6,005 pounds, could maintain a turning radius of approximately 785 feet at combat speeds. The Bearcat's turning radius exceeded 950 feet under the same conditions. In a dogfight where survival often depended on getting inside an opponent's turn to achieve a firing solution, this 165-foot disadvantage proved lethal. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics convened a technical review board in February 1945 to address the crisis. Senior aeronautical engineers examined every possible solution. They calculated that adding wing area would reduce climb rate below acceptable parameters. Reducing weight further would compromise structural integrity needed for carrier operations. Restricting the Bearcat to pure boom and zoom tactics ignored the reality that combat situations often forced pilots into turning engagements regardless of doctrine. Commander Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot and a veteran of combat operations, delivered a sobering assessment to the review board on February 28, 1945. The Bearcat represented a fundamental design compromise that couldn't be engineered away. The aircraft would excel at interception and high-speed attack, but pilots needed to avoid turning dogfights at all costs. Those who found themselves in sustained turns against Zeros would be at a severe disadvantage. The review board accepted this conclusion and drafted new tactical doctrine, emphasizing strict engagement discipline. But fleet commanders facing daily kamikaze attacks couldn't afford such limitations. They needed a fighter that could win in any situation, not one that required perfect tactical conditions. The stakes were measured in ships lost and sailors killed. Between January and March 1945, kamikaze attacks sank or damaged 368 American vessels. Many of these attacks succeeded because defending fighters couldn't maintain pursuit through the evasive maneuvers Japanese pilots executed in their final approach. Grumman Flight Test Center, Bethpage, Long Island, March 1945. Robert Elder doesn't look like someone who will revolutionize fighter tactics. At 32 years old, he's never fired a shot in combat, never landed on a carrier deck, never even worn a military uniform. His background consists of a mechanical engineering degree from MIT, 3 years testing experimental aircraft for Grumman, and a growing reputation among Navy liaison officers as that civilian who keeps breaking our airplanes. Elder's job involves pushing aircraft to their absolute limits to map performance envelopes and identify failure modes before they kill military pilots. This requires a particular mindset that doesn't align well with established procedures. He's already been reprimanded twice for exceeding test parameters, and his personnel file contains a memo from a Navy commander noting that Elder demonstrates insufficient respect for approved flight envelopes and standardized control inputs. On March 18, 1945, Elder is conducting routine handling tests in Bearcat prototype number 12 when he encounters something unexpected. While practicing combat maneuvers at 12,000 feet, he enters a hard left turn at 240 knots indicated airspeed. The Bearcat responds predictably, settling into a steady turn with moderate buffeting as it approaches its aerodynamic limits. But as Elder continues the turn, he inadvertently applies too much left rudder while simultaneously easing back pressure on the stick. The Bearcat's nose suddenly yaws sharply left, while the aircraft continues its turn. Elder feels the airframe shudder, hears the stall warning horn chirp briefly, and experiences a momentary sensation of the tail sliding outward. His training screams at him to correct this departure from coordinated flight immediately, but something makes him hold the controls steady for another 2 seconds. When he rolls out and checks his position, Elder realizes he's completed the turn approximately 150 feet inside his normal turning radius. He's also lost nearly 80 knots of airspeed and dropped 400 feet of altitude, but he's turned significantly tighter than the Bearcat's documented capabilities should allow. For most pilots, this would be an interesting anomaly to note in the post-flight report. For Elder, it's a puzzle that demands investigation. He spends the next 40 minutes deliberately recreating the maneuver, varying rudder input, stick position, and entry speed. Each time he applies aggressive rudder in the direction of the turn, while simultaneously reducing back pressure on the stick. The Bearcat enters a partially uncoordinated turn that dramatically reduces turning radius. The aircraft doesn't stall completely, but it operates in a regime that every manual and every instructor defines as dangerous and incorrect. When Elder lands and reviews his data, he realizes he's discovered something that contradicts 4 decades of aviation wisdom. Coordinated flight, the fundamental principle drilled into every pilot from their first lesson, might not be optimal for this particular aircraft in this particular situation. The thought is simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Elder knows that presenting his discovery through official channels will result in immediate rejection. The Navy has invested millions of dollars and thousands of engineering hours into the Bearcat program, suggesting that proper technique involves deliberately uncoordinated flight will be dismissed as dangerous nonsense from a civilian who doesn't understand combat aviation. Instead, Elder begins a clandestine testing program. Over the next 2 weeks, he uses scheduled test flights to systematically explore the boundaries of what he privately calls rudder-induced slipping turns. He discovers that the technique works best at speeds between 180 and 260 knots, requires precise timing to avoid actual stalls, and demands constant altitude and energy management to prevent the aircraft from departing controlled flight entirely. The physics behind the maneuver gradually become clear. By applying rudder opposite to the direction of coordinated flight, while reducing angle of attack, Elder is forcing the Bearcat into a controlled slip, where the aircraft's fuselage presents at an angle to the relative wind. This creates additional drag that scrubs energy rapidly, but more importantly, it allows the aircraft to pivot around a tighter radius while maintaining sufficient airflow over the wings to prevent a complete stall. The massive R2800 engine provides enough power to recover lost energy quickly once the maneuver completes. On April 3, 1945, Elder conducts what he considers the definitive test. He arranges for another test pilot to fly a captured A6M5 Zero while he flies Bearcat number 12. The two aircraft engage in a mock dogfight over Long Island Sound, with strict instructions to maintain altitude above 8,000 feet for safety. Using conventional turning tactics, Elder finds himself consistently outside the Zero's turn, exactly as the Patuxent River tests predicted. Then he begins using his rudder technique. The first time he executes the maneuver, the Zero pilot's voice crackles over the radio. "What the hell was that? You just turned inside me." Over the next 20 minutes, Elder demonstrates repeatedly that he can match or exceed the Zero's turning performance, though each maneuver costs him significant energy that requires several seconds to recover. When both aircraft land, the Zero pilot, a former Navy fighter ace named James Sweat, walks over to Elder's Bearcat with a mixture of confusion and anger on his face. "That is illegal," Sweat says flatly. "You're flying uncoordinated. You're skidding through the turns. That's exactly what we teach new pilots not to do because it gets them killed." Elder shows Sweat his flight data. Turning radius reduced by an average of 100 feet, energy loss of approximately 75 knots per sustained turn, recovery time of 6 to 8 seconds with full throttle. Sweat studies the numbers, then looks back at the Bearcat. "The Navy will never approve this," he says. "You're asking pilots to deliberately do something that violates every principle of proper flight technique. You're asking them to operate the aircraft at the edge of a stall in combat conditions. One mistake and they'll spin right into the ocean." But Sweat also understands what the data represents. "If this actually works in combat," he says slowly, "it changes everything. The Bearcat stops being a pure energy fighter and becomes something that can compete in any regime. But you'll never convince the brass. They'll see uncoordinated flight in your report and stop reading." Elder submits his findings to Grumman's chief engineer on April 6, 1945, carefully documenting the technique and its results. The response arrives within 24 hours. "Recommend discontinuing this line of investigation. proposed maneuver violates fundamental principles of safe flight operations and would not receive Navy approval under any circumstances. But Elder has an ally he didn't expect. James Sweat, despite his initial reaction, has been thinking about the tactical implications. Sweat has flown 64 combat missions and shot down 16 Japanese aircraft. He understands that doctrine and theory matter less than what works when someone is trying to kill you. On April 10th, he writes a memo to his former commanding officer, now Captain David McCampbell, describing what he witnessed and suggesting that the Navy at least evaluate Elder's technique before dismissing it. McCampbell, still dealing with poor Bearcat performance in combat, arranges for a demonstration at Naval Air Station Oceana on April 18, 1945. Elder will fly against a Navy pilot in a captured Zero, while a panel of senior officers and engineers observes. The panel includes Commander Frederick Trapnell, who led the February Review Board, along with 3 aeronautical engineers from the Bureau of Aeronautics and 2 combat squadron commanders who have been flying Bearcats in the Pacific. The demonstration begins poorly. Elder's first attempt at the maneuver in front of observers results in a pronounced stall warning and a 600-foot altitude loss that has several observers shaking their heads. His second attempt is smoother, but the Zero still maintains advantage through most of the engagement. Elder can feel his opportunity slipping away as the skepticism in the observation tower grows more palpable. On the third engagement, something clicks. Elder times his rudder input perfectly, manages his energy precisely, and executes a series of slipping turns that put him repeatedly inside the Zero's radius. The Zero pilot, trying every evasive maneuver in his repertoire, cannot shake the Bearcat. After 4 minutes of sustained combat maneuvering, Elder achieves a simulated gun solution 3 separate times. When both aircraft land, the room erupts. Commander Trapnell is furious, his face red, as he confronts Elder on the tarmac. "You just demonstrated the most dangerous flying I've seen outside of actual combat," Trapnell says, his voice rising. "You're operating that aircraft in a regime where one gust of wind, one moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation will put you in an unrecoverable spin. You're asking pilots to fly uncoordinated, which is exactly how we lose people in training accidents." One of the aeronautical engineers joins in. "The loads you're putting on that airframe during those maneuvers haven't been tested. You could be inducing structural fatigue that will cause catastrophic failure after 50 hours. You're essentially skidding a 12,000-pound aircraft through the air, like a car on ice. This is insanity." But Captain McCampbell raises his hand for silence. He's been watching the data recorders and timing the engagements. "How long does it take to recover energy after one of these maneuvers?" he asks Elder directly. 6 to 8 seconds at full throttle, sir," Elder responds. "Less if you can convert altitude to speed." "And how many times can you execute this in a single engagement before you're too slow to continue?" 3 to 4 times before you need to disengage and rebuild energy. But that's usually enough to achieve a firing solution or force the opponent to disengage. McCampbell turns to the squadron commanders. "We're losing pilots because Bearcats can't compete in turning fights. This civilian just demonstrated that the aircraft can match a Zero if flown differently than we've been teaching. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it violates conventional wisdom. But combat is dangerous, and conventional wisdom isn't keeping my pilots alive." The debate continues for another hour, but McCampbell has made his decision. He authorizes a formal test program at Patuxent River with strict parameters and experienced test pilots. If the technique can be validated under controlled conditions, and if pilots can be trained to execute it safely, the Navy will consider incorporating it into combat doctrine. But if a single test pilot gets hurt, or if the data doesn't support Elder's claims, The entire program will be terminated immediately. The Patuxent River test program begins on April 25, 1945, with 6 experienced Navy test pilots learning Elder's technique. The first week is humbling for everyone involved. 2 pilots induce actual spins during practice attempts. Another overstresses the airframe badly enough that the aircraft requires inspection before flying again. The technique demands a level of precision and feel that can't be taught through briefings and manuals. But gradually, the pilots begin to master the rudder-induced slip. By May 10th, all 6 test pilots can execute the maneuver consistently, and the data validates Elder's claims. Against captured Zeros flown by experienced Navy pilots, Bearcats, using the new technique, achieve turning radius reductions averaging 143 feet. More importantly, in simulated combat engagements, the Bearcats achieve firing solutions an average of 12 seconds faster than using conventional tactics. The structural engineers complete their analysis on May 18th. The loads induced by the maneuver remain within the Bearcats' design limits, though they recommend limiting pilots to no more than 4 slipping turns per engagement to prevent fatigue accumulation. The aerodynamicists confirm that the technique exploits a specific characteristic of the Bearcat's design. The massive engine and propeller create powerful slipstream effects that help maintain airflow over the wings even during the partially uncoordinated flight regime. On May 28, 1945, McCampbell authorizes combat deployment of the technique. VF-19, a Bearcat squadron preparing for deployment to Okinawa, receives intensive training from Elder and the Patuxent River test pilots. The squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander William Bonneau, is initially skeptical but becomes a convert after experiencing the technique firsthand. "It feels completely wrong," he tells his pilots during a briefing. "Every instinct will tell you that you're about to stall and spin, but if you trust the airplane and execute precisely, it works." VF-19 arrives at Okinawa on June 12, 1945, and flies its first combat mission 2 days later. The results are immediate and dramatic. On June 14th, Lieutenant Howard Burris encounters 4 A6M5 Zeros attempting to intercept a bombing raid. Using conventional tactics, he shoots down 1 Zero, but finds himself in a turning engagement with the remaining 3. He executes Elder's technique, cutting inside the turn of the nearest Zero and destroying it with a 2-second burst. The 2 remaining Zeros attempt to engage, but Burris uses the slipping turn twice more to achieve firing solutions on both aircraft. He lands with 3 confirmed kills in a single engagement lasting less than 4 minutes. Over the next 6 weeks, VF-19 compiles a combat record that transforms Navy thinking about the Bearcat. The squadron's kill ratio against Japanese fighters reaches 11.3 to 1, with 14 pilots becoming aces. More importantly, the squadron loses only 2 pilots in air-to-air combat during this period, compared to the 14 lost in the previous 3 months by other Bearcat squadrons. German Luftwaffe pilot Hans Wind, who defected to American forces in April 1945 and was shown footage of the technique, provides a telling perspective. This is exactly the kind of tactical innovation that we failed to develop in the late war period. We became so focused on engineering better aircraft that we forgot that tactics matter as much as technology. An inferior aircraft flown with superior tactics will defeat a superior aircraft flown conventionally. The Americans understood this in a way we never did. The data from combat operations validates everything Elder discovered. Bearcats using the slipping turn technique achieve an average of 2.7 firing solutions per engagement compared to 1.4 for conventional tactics. Energy recovery time in actual combat averages 7.2 seconds, close to Elder's test predictions. Most significantly, The technique allows Bearcat pilots to engage Japanese fighters in situations where they previously would have disengaged, preventing numerous successful kamikaze attacks. Lieutenant James Pierce, a VF-19 pilot who shot down 7 Japanese aircraft using the technique, describes the experience in his combat diary. The first time you do it in actual combat, your brain screams that you're about to die. The stall warning horn is blaring, the airframe is shaking, and you're skidding through the air in a way that violates everything you learned in flight school. But then you roll out and you're inside his turn, and he's filling your gun sight, and you realize this crazy civilian from New York just saved your life. By July 1945, the Navy has incorporated Elder's technique into official training doctrine for all Bearcat squadrons. The technique receives the formal designation high rudder slipping turn in training manuals, though pilots universally refer to it as Elder's slide. Training protocols emphasize the precision required and the dangers of improper execution, but also the tactical advantages when performed correctly. The impact on pilot survival is measurable and profound. Between June 15 and August 15, 1945, Bearcat squadrons employing Elder's technique lose 6 pilots in air-to-air combat, while achieving 127 confirmed kills. Squadrons still using conventional tactics lose 19 pilots while achieving 83 kills during the same period. The difference represents lives saved through tactical innovation rather than technological advancement. The war ends before the full potential of Elder's technique can be realized in combat, but its impact on naval aviation doctrine proves lasting and significant. Post-war analysis by the Naval Air Warfare Center determines that the high rudder slipping turn saved an estimated 43 American pilots' lives during the final months of the Pacific War. More broadly, it demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome design limitations, a lesson that would influence fighter development and training for decades. The Grumman F8F Bearcat never achieved the combat record of aircraft like the Hellcat or Corsair simply because the war ended too soon after its deployment. But the 1,065 Bearcats that were produced served with distinction in the immediate post-war period, and Elder's technique became standard training for all Bearcat pilots. The aircraft remained in U.S. Navy service until 1952 and continued flying with foreign air forces through the 1960s. What makes Elder's innovation particularly significant is that it emerged from empirical testing rather than theoretical analysis. The Navy's aeronautical engineers, working with the best tools and knowledge available, had concluded that the Bearcat's turning limitations were fundamental and insurmountable. Elder, approaching the problem from a test pilot's perspective rather than an engineer's, discovered that the aircraft could do things its designers never intended, if flown in ways that contradicted established doctrine. Commander David McCampbell, reflecting on the controversy in a 1946 interview, offered this assessment. "We almost rejected Elder's discovery because it violated our assumptions about proper flying technique. That would have been a catastrophic mistake born of institutional rigidity. The lesson isn't just about this particular maneuver, it's about remaining open to innovation even when it challenges our fundamental assumptions, especially when it challenges our fundamental assumptions." The technique itself influenced post-war fighter design and doctrine in subtle but important ways. Aircraft designers began paying more attention to how fighters performed in partially uncoordinated flight regimes, recognizing that combat situations might demand maneuvers that violated peacetime training standards. Fighter pilot training incorporated more emphasis on energy management and unconventional maneuvering, acknowledging that survival sometimes required techniques that seemed counterintuitive or even dangerous. Modern fighter aircraft, with their fly-by-wire controls and computer-managed flight envelopes, have largely automated the kind of precise control inputs that Elder's technique required. But the fundamental principle remains relevant. Aircraft can often perform beyond their documented capabilities if pilots understand the aerodynamics deeply enough and possess the skill to exploit them. Test pilots at the Navy's Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, the famous Top Gun School, still study Elder's innovation as an example of how tactical creativity can overcome technological limitations. Robert Elder himself remained characteristically modest about his contribution. He continued working as a test pilot for Grumman until 1958, then retired to a small farm in Connecticut. He refused numerous requests for interviews, declined an invitation to speak at the Naval Academy, and never wrote a memoir. When a researcher tracked him down in 1973 to discuss his technique for a military aviation history, Elder's response was brief. "I just flew the airplane the way it wanted to be flown. Any good test pilot would have discovered the same thing eventually." But Lieutenant Howard Burris, who survived the war and became a commercial airline pilot, had a different perspective. In a letter to Elder written in 1967, Burris wrote, "I never met you, and you probably don't remember my name from any report, but on June 14, 1945, I used your technique to shoot down 3 Zeros that would have killed me if I'd fought them conventionally. I flew 847 combat missions after that day, came home, married my sweetheart, raised 3 children, and lived to see my grandchildren. All of that happened because a civilian test pilot was willing to break the rules and think differently. You saved my life and the lives of dozens of other pilots you never met." We remember, even if history doesn't. Elder died in 1989 at age 76, his obituary making no mention of his contribution to naval aviation. But at Oceana Naval Air Station, a small plaque in the Fighter Pilot Ready Room commemorates his innovation with a simple inscription: Robert Elder, 1913-1989, test pilot. He taught us that the impossible just requires different thinking. The story of Elder's rudder technique reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected places and challenges our most fundamental assumptions. The experts, with all their knowledge and experience, had concluded the problem was unsolvable. The civilian test pilot, with no combat experience, found the solution by questioning whether the rules themselves might be wrong. In war, as in life, survival sometimes demands that we abandon what we know is correct and embrace what actually works. That distinction, uncomfortable as it may be, often makes all the difference between failure and success, between death and life, between accepting limitations and discovering possibilities we never knew existed.